My name's Zach Martin. I'm a senior policy advisor here at Venable. I work with Jeremy on on all things Better Identity Coalition related. I appreciate you all taking the time to show up today. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about mobile driver's licenses, one of my personal favorite topics happening in the digital identity space. And we have a great panel here to kind of share their opinions and their takes on what's happening in the mobile driver's license ecosystem. So I don't really want to delay this anymore. I'm going to start off by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and answer the simple question of what do they think the state of the mobile driver's license ecosystem is? So Ryan, let's start off with you.
Can everyone hear me all right?
Yep.
All right, cool. Apologies. I wasn't even sure I was going to make it today. I have a sick wife and a sick kid at home right now, but still trying to reconstitute all my thoughts after a fairly chaotic morning. But I am Ryan Galuzzo. I am the identity program lead for NIST Applied Cybersecurity Division. Essentially, that means I manage a portfolio of projects, all focused on different aspects of identity. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the digital identity guidelines. So we work on that, as well as working on a project within the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, looking at how you take mobile driver's license and implement them in online use cases and online scenarios. And also looking in particular at how those can be supported for very specific targeted sector use cases. So financial institutions, government services, as well as healthcare. So working through all those different challenges, I would say as far as the state of mDL, and I'll actually expand it beyond mDL to kind of this concept of verifiable digital credentials, which is a term we are starting to use for other kinds of cryptographically provable forms of identity. I think it's maturing, right? It's one of those things where the standards are very rapidly evolving. We've got a pretty stable set of initial standards from ISO, but we're also starting to see the initial set of standards to support online presentation, online issuance of these various different credentials. So it's in flux, but I think the good news is that there's a lot of different components working towards a common set of goals. They don't all necessarily have the same outcome in mind, but in general, I think we're starting to see movement towards a few key aspects of standardization within the space.
Thanks. Stefan?
Hi, I'm Stefan Schubert, JP Morgan Chase. I am a product owner owning our identity strategy for consumer and small business clients. Before that, I did about 15 years in different fraud functions. I have managed every type of identity authentication fraud there is across different financial products. So it's fun to hear all these stories. It's very painful to hear Linda's story earlier. I'm like, that sounds kind of familiar to some things. So the state of the mDL ecosystem, in a few words, sort of almost ripe, right? I feel like we're getting there. So many of the standards are set. So many of the protocols make sense. What's awesome about being in the space is I rarely hear things I don't like. So every time we talk about new methods of in-person use versus remote use, I'm not really hearing anything that concerns me or scares me. It's really just a matter of getting there, getting adoption, getting ubiquity across both consumers, citizens, and consuming agencies like banks. So it feels inevitable at this point, which is great, but it still does feel very early. And I think we'll probably inevitably today talk about how to make it move a little faster.
Thanks. Angelique?
Hi, I'm Angelique McClendon, General Counsel for the Georgia Department of Driver Services. So we are the DMV in Georgia. And I also am very active with AMVA, our national DMV organization, and I chair the mDL subcommittee. And the state of the mDL ecosystem now is one that is growing and it continues to move forward. And like Stefan, I don't hear anything that that gives me pause or that I don't like. But it's sort of at a chicken and an egg stage where it's a balance between, do you spend more energy implementing and adding more states to have, so you have more mDL users, or do you search for more reliant parties so the mDL users you have will have somewhere they can actually use their mDL. And we've come to the conclusion that you need to be doing both, right? And so it takes a lot of collaboration. So I think where we are now is that there is a need for more collaboration between verifiers, relying parties, the wallet providers all to collaborate on one common goal, and that is to promote the use of digital identity in mDL.
And last but not least, Jason.
Yeah, I was here a couple of years ago. I forgot how intimidating this room is actually. Speaking to the thought leaders of the industry. It's not doing wonders for my fear of public speaking, but I'm the Identity Management Capability Manager at TSA. So for the last couple of years, I've been spearheading our agency's rollout of facial recognition as well as digital ID, of which mDL is a major part. So we started accepting mDLs with Arizona. I think it was March of 22. I think it was in Apple Wallet. Then it was Maryland, then Georgia. So now we are accepting mDLs from 14 states and territories. Puerto Rico is one. Across 8 different digital wallet platforms. Apple, Samsung, Google, the usual suspects. Then you also have third-party digital wallets like IDEMIA's Get Group, Invoke for Louisiana, then Spruce, and Canadian banknotes for Virginia that just launched their mDLs, right? So started with a couple of hundred, testing in the beginning. Now, as of December of last year, 24, we had over about 2 million digital ID transactions. Not everything was mDL. We had 3 times the volume growth over last year. What's interesting is that we had mDL transactions across 60 airports, which means some states that don't issue mDLs, airports in those locations also encounter mDLs. As a relying party, we are going to have about 2,000 reader machines. You all travel, right? So we call them the CAT2 machines, it's a credential authentication technology, 2nd generation machines. So that has that nose piece, that's the mDL reader. So we are turning those on across the whole enterprise. So we should have about 2,087 of those CAT2 mDL readers across 230 plus airports, and all of them should be functional by the end of, let's say, March, give us a little leeway. So that's where we are from, our relying party perspective.
I want to kind of leave it with Angelique and Jason to start. Angelique, you were one of the first 3 or 4 states to start issuing mobile driver's licenses, and Jason, and TSA is honestly probably the largest relying party out there accepting mobile driver's license at this point in time. So let's start. Angelique, can you kind of talk about what you've seen? Like, it's been 2 or 3 years since you all have rolled out your mDL, kind of what you've seen, what some of the challenges that you got all of experience, and kind of what you see kind of going forward with the program.
All right, so we started our mDL efforts with the native wallets, actually about 2017. And we launched, our first implementation was with Apple in 2023, and later that year with Google, and then just a few months ago with Samsung. So we are in all of the native phone wallets, and our thought behind that was that we wanted to go with what the customer was familiar with. So the likely customer who will use the mDL or would be excited about it are the people who are already using payments in their digital wallets. We had moderate success with our own DMV app, where you could look at your record, you can renew, you can do a lot of things on your app, but not many people are really excited to, add another app to their phone, especially a DMV app. So we figured we would go with what they're familiar with, which would be their native wallets. So far, we had a lot of excitement about it, social media excitement, and we have a little over 420,000 provisioned. Sounds like a lot, but that's really only a single-digit percentage of the eligible customers who could have it. So there's some more promotion that we need to do in-house. And as far as a relying party, of course, TSA has been a relying party and a great partner from the beginning. And we're trying to expand it for some everyday use cases. So we have some great use cases. We've demonstrated our own use case. And so we had a couple pilots. We partnered with Credence ID for some hardware. And we've also worked with our vendors, current vendors, Apple, Google, Samsung, just to have what we call, as far as, especially with Apple, an app clip. And so it's a QR code you can scan when you're at our location, and it will verify you through your mDL. And it takes that check-in process from about 10 minutes where you had to go over. Our person would welcome you in the lobby, send you over to a computer. We call the tech decks, and they're just really Chromebooks that are attached to a piece of furniture, and they're typing in all your same information that we already have. If you're coming in to renew, we know your name, we know your date of birth, your address, we know all this information that we're asking you, and you have to kind of retype it, and it takes about 10 minutes to answer all those questions. But instead, if you can verify with your mDL through a Credence device or the app clip, it takes it from 10 minutes to less than 5 minutes, because what it does is it verifies. So it knows it's Angelique. And so it can display this information because it's verified that identity. So once you verify your identity, the person's identity, whoever your customer is, there's so much more you can do with your processes. So we realized that, and it will pre-populate all of the information that that they have in the system, that this is what you told us last time. Is this information still correct? What needs to be changed? So that cuts that time down, that check-in time down in half. The only issue we have is that we need more mDL users. So it works great. But we just need to have the people to have the mDL when they come to the location to be able to actually use it the way it's intended to be used. So what we've seen is we need to probably shift some marketing. We've relied on some data recently to show us, by zip code, how many downloads do you have? So of course, for Georgia, we have a few metropolitan areas besides Atlanta. Of course, there's Atlanta, but you have Savannah, you have Augusta, Columbus, Georgia. Some might even say Valdosta, Georgia, which is close to Florida. But we wanted to see where that population was. And of course, about 38% of the downloads and the provisions are within the metro Atlanta area. And so we thought we'd target some marketing to get more people to provision the mDL so they can have it. But then we're also meeting with other possible relying parties, local retailers, banks, to get them on board, because really aside from the online presentment, which will offer more opportunities for use, in-person presentment, really a good use case needs to be something that's an everyday mundane use case where people are used to presenting their ID at a bank, at their pharmacy, to buy alcohol, to buy restricted items. Those are the use cases where people will say, hey, this is really working for me. I really like it. It's not just this cool item I can show off on my phone. So a lot of young kids like it for that, but we really like to see more use so we can have more downloads and it can actually work like it's intended.
And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about getting more reliant parties, the whole chicken and egg problem that has plagued the digital identity ecosystem for 20 some years, for as long as I've been around. But we'll get to that a little bit more later. First, Jason wanted to talk to you a little bit about TSA. You all have been driving the mDL by the federal government. You put out the new Real ID rule last fall. Can you talk a little bit about that, kind of what was involved in that process and what's next from the TSA's perspective?
Sure, absolutely. Last year, that was an exciting, actually, milestone for us. So we started, we have what we call a CRADA, Cooperative R&D Agreements, with 17 issuing authorities and a couple of technology vendors. So basically what we did on this, based on this R&D agreement, we rolled out mDL's acceptance as a R&D effort, as a kind of a field assessment effort. And based on those lessons learned, we embarked on a rulemaking process. So it took about 3 years, started out with RFIs and, NPRM, the whole, everybody knows how that process goes. Adjudicating all the comments and whatnot. So that all those lessons learned basically went into the substance of the regulations that popped out as a final rule that defines what an mDL has to look like, has to be Real ID compliant, basically, right? It came on the Real ID Authority. So that rule was published as a final rule October 25th. went into effect November 25th, a month after. So starting, when the real ID enforcement begins on May 7th. So basically, we have a process by which we are going to evaluate the compliance packages from issuing authority based on the final rule regulations requirements. And, based on that evaluation, decide to continue or begin accepting mDLs from that state. So besides the enforcement compliance piece, what we are excited really about is, for us, at least for TSA's in-person acceptance, it really lays out the minimum requirements, the baseline for privacy, security, interoperability, by which an mDL becomes acceptable to us because it is real ID compliance, quote unquote, right? So it is a kind of hopefully a foundational regulatory framework that is focused on TSA and real ID use cases, but perhaps extensible to other in-person use cases as well.
Thank you, Jason. It's great. We've heard from a state that's issuing it. We've heard about it from an RP that's accepting them in person. But one of the things that, Better Identity Coalition has been pushing for is the online use cases. How can these credentials be consumed online for identity verification, which is definitely a critical missing step that we don't have at this point. So I want to ask Brian, you all have the project at the NCCOE happening right now with financial services companies. So you talk a little bit about that and where you're at with that project.
Yeah, absolutely. And if Jason and TSA are driving, I'd like to think we're at least in the passenger seat on a lot of this stuff, making use of the good work they do, particularly around things like the issuance process, the core security and expectations of how states are doing the protection of the data involved. So we don't have to repeat that, right? The Real ID waiver process has already covered that. So what we've decided to focus on is what can we do to help advance understanding of how to deploy these kinds of technologies in an online environment. So how can we look at the process of being able to take that credential that you can currently only use right now to go through TSA and allow my end users to be able to go through the process of presenting it when they try and open a bank account online, when they try and access federal government services, when they try and access state and local services. How do we create that kind of ubiquity of use cases so we can drive the chicken and egg scenario where people are actually asking for it? Now, obviously, there's the challenges of how do we understand the underlying party requirements as well, too. But so what we're trying to do within the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, and I'll actually do a quick show of hands, does everyone know what the NCCOE National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence is? Yeah, that's a pretty good percentage, but there are at least a couple that don't. So we'll put it out there. It's essentially a collaborative space. It's a laboratory space where we bring in partners from across government and across industry to help actively address cybersecurity use cases, right? So we'll bring in partners from industry, partners from government, and then we'll bring in our own technology to help people actually stitch these things together into complete use cases. So for the mobile driver's license use case, we're bringing together financial institutions right now as the relying parties, bringing together multiple wallet providers. So we've got at least 3 wallet providers right now that all have different versions and different flavors of their mobile driver's license. We've got one verifier that's going through the process of actually running the online process for verifying these things. We're working with providers that cover things like the trust fabric side of the house. So AMVA, the Open ID Foundation, organizations that kind of cover the standards and specifications that support this. So the goal is to replicate to the greatest degree possible a full and complete online use case so that we can establish and understand where are the current standards today, what needs to continue to be improved. Then we can also start to look at things that aren't being considered by those standards. Things like, how do we take into account the user experience, right? Because if the financial institutions are looking at this and saying, it's confusing, it's hard to understand, the process is complicated, they're not going to want to implement it. So how can we start to think about standardizing that user experience, improving that user experience, so by the time we get to adoption, we've got some best practices on what it looks like to that end user. Even more importantly, probably, is how do we start to take into account the relying party requirements from a compliance and regulatory perspective? Almost all of these organizations are going to have to think about, how does this particular process meet what I have to show to my regulators, to my auditors, and how can we make sure that we start to bring their voice into the conversation as early as possible. I think one of the key lessons, two key lessons that we learned from passkeys were, one, they did a really good job of trying to think about how do we bring in some of the UX and consistent user experience early on. Fido did a really great study on how do we actually put together some initial use cases for that passkey, provide user experience guidance. On the other side of the house, we're having the same conversation of how do we get financial institutions to want to use passkeys? And we're kind of adding on layers on top of passkey to promote additional trust in how those technologies work. We want to move that up forward. We want to start thinking about what the challenges are for the relying parties and making sure they're starting to be reflected in the actual standards, specifications, and guidance that we can put out, that other organizations can put out, to make it easier for them to adopt in the long run and have an illustration of how these things meet their guidance and requirements that they have as organizations. So trying to bring all of this together in a pseudo business context so that we can start to think about things beyond just the core standards, but also how the relying parties are impacted and how the user is impacted by what we're deploying.
Stefan, I know it's been a while, but we get to you. So what's your take on mobile driver's license? Where are you coming from on this topic, and what would you like to see? What are you happy with what you've seen so far, and kind of like how do you see things progressing?
Yeah, so reiterate, very happy with what we've seen so far. It is a question of adoption, chicken and egg. One interesting thing about the user experience, right? When you look at this as a purely just from my standpoint, right? When a customer comes to us, if they've already enrolled in a mobile driver's license, there's almost nothing but upside for us, right? Like they've gone through this friction already. They've done the process to enroll in this very strong credential. We just have to figure out how to accept it. And in theory, at least, it is a stronger fraud deterrent than pretty much everything else that's commercially viable right now. So from my perspective, it's very easy to advocate internally to my partners and stakeholders why we want to invest in MDL. The question is always about when. When does it become more important than the other 12 things we're probably working on at the same time? You give a number of citizens in Georgia that have already enrolled. It's always a question for us of, should I invest in servicing those 500,000 customers or in servicing 5 million other customers, even if I know ultimately, like I said earlier, MDL is inevitable. So we're going to continue exploring how to help boost that adoption with other partners. The more we hear about government agencies like the TSA adopting it, the easier it becomes for me to go internally advocate and say, like, to my compliance partners and legal partners, and say, if it's good enough for the TSA, it should be good enough to open a bank account, right? It should be easy enough. But this is all on sort of the initial adoption side. When I think about the challenges we'll run into, they're much more around unraveling the ecosystem we have around not using MDLs. So like most big firms, you got thousands of applications all built around consuming certain things. We have certain applications which are built around, driver's licenses. I'm sure all sorts of different institutions have practices and policies and procedures on how to accept a physical driver's license. You then need to kind of rebuild that entire ecosystem across whatever institution you're talking about. And that's where the challenge lies. The actual technology integration of saying, I will accept an MDL is not immensely complicated. I'm sure it could be, there's always the joke about someone can build a hackathon in 24 hours. You have to do it in production, it'll take 6 months. That would apply here, right? I'm sure someone could build a very slapdash version very quickly. To build it in production would take a long time. But the challenge would then be just propagating it to every other system you have in your institution. And that's where we're working on, we're thinking about right now, is how to fit it into all the other systems.
If we're thinking about the mobile driver's license, or even the larger verifiable document, VDoc kind of ecosystem, and like if Genie popped out and said, hey, I'll give you 2 wishes to fix mobile driver's license or verifiable credentials, what would you ask for? Stefan, we'll start with you.
There's going to be a theme here. Right? It's just one wish. This is adoption. So can you come back to me while I think about a second wish?
Sure.
That first wish was.
We'll come back to you. Yeah. Ryan.
I mean, I think if I had wishes, one of the things that I think we would focus on, one of the things we're starting to think about here is the question of presentation and how we keep things consistent and viable for the largest set of users possible, right? Because I think our goal is to let the user have as few or as many wallets and credentials as they want, right? Like I think last year when I was here, I said something to the effect of, we don't want people to have 1,000 wallets to present 1,000 credentials. At the same time, if that person wants to have one wallet and present 1,000 credentials at it, that should be an option as well too. And so thinking about how we streamline and get all of the standards moving in the same place, and also start to break through some of the credential data format type battles that are ongoing, because at the end of the day, the people who lose the battle over credential formats and lack of interoperability, it's not the people producing the technology, it's the end users and the relying parties that want to ultimately implement and shoot and put that stuff in place. So I would say one, kind of moving towards standardized, singular, ideally kind of presentation protocols, and on the other side of the house, kind of breaking through and making sure that as we start to think about decisions that we make about credential and credential formats, we start to think about the end user and how we better service them as far as that goes.
Angelique?
How many wishes?
2.
Two. So obvious one is more adoption, right? So if I could just wave a magic wand and have everyone have it magically in your wallet, ready to go, ready to use, I would do that. But obviously adoption, so people and the customers and the relying parties would see the obvious benefits, right? Because we don't want to make it too complicated, because, you know, your average, say, liquor store or your mom and pop shop, they don't really care about any of the technical stuff we've been talking about all day. They care about cybersecurity to the extent that someone can help them protect what they need to protect, but the details don't really matter. So if there was some way to make the benefits easier and instant to those who would benefit from it, being relying parties like banks or retailers, even sporting facilities, anywhere where you have customers and you want to know who those customers are, that would be another wish. Because like Stefan mentioned, friction, the DMVs have already dealt with all the friction, right? We've asked people to bring in, I need your birth certificate, all your marriage licenses, your divorce decrees, all this paperwork we need, social security numbers. So if that's not friction, I don't know what is. And so we've dealt with that from millions of customers, millions of people. So we've done the heavy lifting, and we can be that foundation for knowing your customer. And again, depending on your industry, you might want to layer other KYC things on top of that, right? Like if it's banking, you want to know payment history, maybe credit. If it's housing, maybe you want some other information. But definitely at the foundation of that is this person who they say they are?
Jason?
Yeah, the answer is the same adoption, and there are a couple of reasons for that, right? CSA is probably the largest consumer in-person identity, right? We have to verify 2 to 3 million passengers daily, right? And most of it's based, obviously, driver's license about 70%, 65 to 75%. It's dropping a little because probably fear of real ID enforcement, right? So more people are bringing passports. So we got 20, 25% and 5%, odds and ends, right? So physical ID, there's a definite heightened risk of fake IDs, imposter attacks, right? And there are a lot of really, really good fake IDs out there. And there's a limit, although we authenticate it automatically using our machines, there's a limit, and some fake IDs are good enough. So digital ID from a security perspective is much, much better, right? Because you can't really fake an mDL, really, right? So from security perspective, which is first and foremost for us, is actually paramount. From a customer experience perspective, it was glitchy in the beginning, but right now we're actually clocking a median time of 6.2 seconds processing time, which is really on par with physical ID for mDLs. So, and hopefully it gets better. So, and people usually don't have their wallets available, but they have their phones in their hands, right? So hopefully becomes a really seamless process. And, privacy, selective disclosure based on the ISO standard 18013-5 allows us to minimize the data we ask, right? We don't need your organ donor status or that you can drive a truck, right? So your height or brown hair color, we just need your name, gender, date of birth, photo, digital photo, which is also signed, which is great. And also, just metadata about the ID itself, the expiration date, who issued it and whatnot. So it allows us to minimize data. So across that 3 pillars, actually it's a superior form of ID. So the more people actually uses mDL, actually it's great for us. Then the second wish would be, it's it's Ryan's fault, basically, you know, so. But basically what we actually, I agree with Ryan is, so kind of standardized by which we can consume this type of ID. So it has been TSA policy that we have 2,000 meters based on mDL standards, right? MDocs. So we don't going through the acquisition process, creating another hardware software configuration, for another type of IDs, digital IDs that we have to accept. It's not a trivial matter. So universalize, at least for in-person acceptance along the MD 18013-5, that has been our driving basically strategy for different types of digital ID, not necessarily just MDL. So those are kind of two considerations that we have.
Yeah, I think those the standardized presentation protocols are going to be huge for promoting adoption. That said, I'm going to change both my answers to adoption.
I thought about my second wish. It's
Adoption?
to be a naysayer, right? It's actually vigilance, because as anyone who's been in the fraud industry a long time will tell you, when you launch a new solution that sounds like a silver bullet, the best thing you get is about 12 months of silver bullet, and then maybe 2 years of bronze bullet, and then after that, it just kind of goes to heck. So I think it's really critical, as we're all super excited about this ecosystem and standing it up, to remember that right now, for all of us, MDLs are almost a hobby, right? Like they're not a must-have for consumers yet. I don't have to find a way to service every customer. It's really an opt-in for that customer. The fallback is always your physical ID. If we get to a state where this becomes the standard thing that I would expect from everyone, that also means we have to have account recovery for everyone. That also means that DMVs will suddenly become attacked by fraudsters, which is something that we've probably never really seen at scale. But the second an MDL becomes the only way to send $100,000 wire, will be the first time a driver's license, a DMV is under attack, right? And you'll see people like we see everywhere across financial institutions. We saw periods where in-person branch fraud sort of subsided and then ticked back up, because fraudsters are not afraid to go into a branch and attempt fraud. So I think the things we rely on to provision in the first place, the things we rely on as our silver bullets, will inevitably sort of need shining. So on the one hand, it is, again, adoption, because I want to see everyone use this, because it's clearly better than anything we're using today. But then we can't get too lax and think it's going to actually solve all of our problems. There will continue to need to be layered controls and thoughts of how the next smart bad guy will break this.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I think there's, I don't know if I would call it a wish so far as thinking about that next phase of, once these kinds of things do become ubiquitous, what are the new sets of risks and challenges we need to be thinking about? Not just going after the DMVs, which I think is very realistic if this starts to reach a kind of broader spectrum of adoption, but what are the privacy implications as these become more adopted? How can we spend a little bit more time on things like zero knowledge proofs and how those can be integrated into the broader infrastructure? We have use cases like age assertions that we're expecting to see for a lot of things, and do we really need to know exactly who you are to do that? No. How can we create pathways to allow increase privacy, but also we've got an ecosystem that's moving, right? So, there's been some proposals from different parts of the ecosystem about how to address these things, but I think, that's going to be, we need to keep our eye on that kind of future state to understand what it looks like and make sure that there is trust in the overall ecosystem, because if there's things that start to erode whether people are confident in their privacy and using these things, it's going to impact those wishes of adoption. And then also the question of, how do we deal with people asking for this and the information when they shouldn't be, right? So how do we also manage some of the expectations around who should I be sharing my MDL with? And a lot of this is going to rely in the US on things like user education and stuff like that. But there's going to be some technical roles to play there for helping the end user understand that this might not be a safe place for you to share your mobile driver's license. Not much we can do to say you can't ask for it because of the way the US is structured. But at the same time, there are things that can be done through our partners in the browser space and in the technology space to be able to help the user make the right decision. So I think there's a lot of things that are going to start to become even more apparent as being critical as we start to see increases in adoption and increases of interest in new spaces and use cases that we're not even considering right now.
Yeah, there's definitely is a little bit of a gap in the governance space at this point in time. We'll see how that.
Yeah, I had to throw that to you. That was for you.
Appreciate that.
Talk for you.
We'll see how that gets gets taken care of. And, along the adoption front, the not yet repealed cybersecurity EO from last week did call for grants for states to begin issuing mobile driver's licenses. But I'm not going to hold my breath. All right, we have like 3 minutes left, so why don't we open it up for any questions from the audience, Congressman?
So, actually, what you just mentioned, what I had a series of discussions with ACO. This the question of whether the collection of information from it should become a licensing. Just something that we're sort of enthusiastic. Just the idea that you can't just sit there and start because that's a nightmare scenario. Is that every time you want to smile, and so if there was a like different licenses that you're going to collect information that promises needed at a certain time, and so on, there would be just a license for collection. And that actually might be licenses.
I'm not sure what that last piece was, but I mean, in Europe, that's kind of what they're doing, right? In order to register as a relying party to ask for a credential, you have to go through a certification process. You have to follow their kind of their European data laws and data protection laws. We don't have a corollary here in the United States. So I think that's a little bit outside the standards lane. As long as the standards lane, we can help create like the flags to be able to say, I'm not going to retain this. You can't retain this. You will not retain this. I think those are things we can address, but I think there's a bigger policy question of how do we deal with this and how do we manage this that I mean, like I have opinions on, but like there's not like a NIST view.
Politics easier to deal with. It's like you can't just, you're not going to have to show.
So as a relying parties, what we have done is we institute terminal authentication. So basically, distribute MPC to all readers to make sure that the person actually, or the machine or the wallet knows that it's a genuine authentic TSA terminal. Obviously that's obvious from TSA perspective, right? Because you're at the airports, TSA, but we wanted to kind of model, a nice behavior as a large relying parties. And we delete all the biometrics upon match, as you well know. So, make sure that we have the right data retention policy, privacy policies that's transparent and public. Having said that, I don't think, that gap still does exist, right? Because it's unenforceable.
So just a quick question, Jason, along the lines of the TSA experience, I can say, having been in the authentication space for many years and focused on consumer behavior, when I found out, I'm from Maryland, when I found out I could use an mDL at the airport, I was like, yes, I downloaded my mDL. I was so excited. I got online, I stood on this long line to go through the TSA. And when I got up there all excited to use it, I couldn't even figure out where in the setup I was supposed to do that. There was no sign of anything. And when I said, oh, I have a Maryland mDL, can I use it? The guy's like, yeah, I wouldn't.
So,
so when it comes to, he didn't give any explanation why, just, yeah, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Okay, thanks. So when it comes to adoption and we're thinking about TSA, I mean, I certainly have an idea, make the line shorter for people who have mDLs than for other people. So cut in front of the clear people and people will download mDL in 2 seconds. But along those lines, there's really no incentive to produce an mDL at the one place where it is, broadly accepted. It's not setting us up for success in that environment. So it's interesting because if you go back in time to when airlines used to issue paper tickets, and that's all anyone knew how to do, come to the airport with that, sacred paper ticket. And then when you got there, suddenly there were these kiosks and you had to you could download your boarding pass on your phone. Oh my God, what is this, crazy world we live in? And now everybody does it and they're already holding their phone in their hand. And then they get to the TSA and it's like, pull out the old, driver's license. So there's lots of opportunity to play off of people's existing experience with their phones in the airport. I'm just not seeing it translated into true encouragement for people online to interrupt the very long line process by going, oh, I have this funky new thing called an MDL. Where do I put it? So just feedback to you that maybe it's not a question, just an observation, that there's a lot of opportunity to increase adoption if people knew that that was an advantage to them in any way when they got to the ticket.
Yeah, I
Thank-
think that's a fair criticism. Hopefully, it is a process to implement. It's hard to normalize a certain behavior, of the machine itself as well as the officers, unless you actually can roll it out enterprise-wide. So we're really excited by this like March. Then all the machines out there will have their MDLs turned on. All the training would have been done. So hopefully the behavior becomes better from both sides and passengers be more used to it. I mean, one little things that really affects customer experience. So we have that nose piece, which is the MDL reader, has an antenna there. Well, antenna is actually towards the edge, except if you put the sticker with a Wi-Fi sign towards the, the top parts, then that's where customers or passengers will tap, right? It won't work, right? We're going to engage, the NFC is not close enough, right? So things like little things like that, you only learn through operational assessment, and hopefully we can make those tweaks to do that. In terms of adoption, I think that's a great point. I think it really behooves us to think about MDL use in different ways. Right now, we only use it to verify, to replace a physical ID. It's the same behavior, except instead of a physical ID, you present a digital ID. The great thing about MDL is the trust and the assurance. It's really about the trust in that identity. So if we can actually leverage some of the work that Ryan is doing for online presentment, and instead of on the identity verification piece, which happens at the checkpoint, if we can actually move to the left on the identity management value chain to go to the identity check-in process or enrollment or registration of a trusted identity, then perhaps you can actually create a different, more touchless experience when you come to the checkpoints without you actually having to assert your identity with a mobile or physical token. Just use your face, to be more of a touchless experience that we have done for other pre-check, customers. So I think we definitely, as TSA, as a relying party, we can actually, once the adoption and the standards are there, we're looking eagerly forward to expand our horizons on that.
All right, well, Ryan, it's all on you. No, we sadly are out of time. So I'd like to thank my panelists for joining us today. Fill us in on the mobile driver license ecosystem. Thank you all.